Welcome to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, grief and transformational life coach and fellow griever, Tara Accardo. Welcome back to the Life with Grief podcast. Today, we are joined by the sweetest guest, Lauren Evans, who is the author of the fictional novel Casket Case. And let me tell you, if you are someone who is grieving or has been through a loss, and that is what ultimately brought you to this podcast, you are going to find her novel so relatable. I randomly and very serendipitously found her novel in an airport of all places when I was on a trip last year. And I can't even explain it to you guys, but I was just immediately drawn to it. And then proceeded to read and finish it very quickly because it was that good. Seriously. Let me give you a super quick synopsis. So it is a novel that is a really beautiful, heartfelt story of a small town girl who is just surrounded by death, literally and figuratively. When an unexpected tragedy turns Nora's life completely upside down, she found herself back in her tiny little hometown running her family's casket business, of all things. And just as a side personal note here, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not really. She found herself back here because both of her parents died in a really tragic accident. And while mine died of cancer, just being an only child and having lost both of my parents as well, I really just kind of connected with this character. So one day, Nora's very ordinary casket selling day is interrupted by a very handsome stranger that wanders into her shop asking for directions and also ends up asking her on a date. So enter Garrett Bishop. He is thoughtful, he's kind, he has a lucrative job as a, quote, logistics coordinator, for which he seems to have a great passion. Nora's not totally sure what logistics entails, but she knows it means long hours, lots of travel, and some random urgent calls in the middle of the night. The small town that she now lives in is called Rabbit Town, and when some of those residents suddenly pass away, a heart attack here, a car crash there, Garrett is spotted at the scenes of all of these deaths, and his vague job description starts to become increasingly suspicious to her. It turns out he is a logistics coordinator for death. And yes, we do find out what that means, but you have to read the book. When Nora discovers the truth, she's just unable to reconcile this amazing man that she knows with this unthinkably cruel job that he loves. I truly cannot recommend this book enough, but in this episode, we're talking all about the book and how it intertwines themes of both love and grief. And we also explore how grief shapes these characters' lives, but how it also reflects on real life grieving experiences that we all go through, and I have no doubt they are ones you can relate to as well. We also talk about some of the challenges that Lauren faced while writing this fictional book about grief and loss in this way, but also how writing served as a really cathartic process for her. This episode really just highlights the importance of acknowledging our grief, giving ourselves permission to feel it, and ultimately find ways to integrate this profound and deeply painful experience into our lives. And the way that Lauren has done this both in her personal life and professional life as a writer is so inspiring. I know you guys are going to love this conversation, and please do go check out her book. It really is so good, you guys. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. Lauren, welcome to the Life with Grief podcast. I am so excited to have you here today. We have had some authors on the podcast here before, but nobody that has written nonfiction. And I am a big nonfiction girly. So I am so excited to just hear your story about this book, how this all came to be. But before we get in, I just want to give people a little bit of context. We are talking about Casket Case here. And I have talked about this book a couple times on my platforms now because like I said, I am big on nonfiction, and I like to think that like the book that I am sort of in the mood for and I'm looking for kind of like very serendipitously finds me sometimes. And I actually found your book randomly in an airport bookstore that on a trip I was on recently. And I was like, just kind of looking around, but yours, I just kept being drawn to it. And then of course, read the back of it and everything. I was like, color me intrigued. I need this book, and read it so quickly because it's such a good read. And I just love the story. But the reason I am having you on the Life with Grief podcast is because there are definitely some griefy elements to this book that I think my listeners will really, really resonate with. Like, I cannot recommend this book enough for those who like nonfiction. And yeah, so I want to dig into all the things, of course, like how you came up with this, but I think there's just some beautiful lessons and takeaways from like the story itself where, there's an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into that. So, that all being said, I want to pass it off to you. Sorry, I ramble. But first of all, a big warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I love hearing that you found it in an airport and that bright purple cover is getting
Yes.
people to it. So,
Can't miss it. It looks very Halloween-esque, which I think as of the time that we're recording this is like, October, November time. But listen, I just want to preface, you do not have to read this book in the Halloween spooky season to appreciate it. There is so much more to this to unpack. But yeah, I really do feel like I came across your book so, like I said, very serendipitously as someone who, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but bare bones minimum, it is about a girl who lost both of her parents. And as someone who has also had two parents die, resonated with it immediately based on that. But there's also a little love story in between there. So we'll get to that. But first, I would love for you to just kind of like introduce yourself a little, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you like to do for fun, all the good things.
yeah, I'm Lauren Evans. I live in Atlanta, Georgia with my beagle Lucy. That is what takes up the majority of my time is
Of course.
catering to all of her needs.
Sure.
I work in higher education as my day job, and Casket Case is my debut novel, and it's based on kind of where I'm from, which is Northeast Alabama. And uh, Rabbit Town is an actual place, but I definitely fictionalized it for the book, stole the name
Yeah.
basically, and made a whole new thing. So,
Love it.
yeah, I
Awesome.
mean, that's
Well,
pretty much me.
I love it, and I love that your dog is, like, so the focus. I too,
Mhm.
once upon a time, had a dog. She also died,
Mhm.
but not to be so doom and gloom, but there are people here that listen that have also lost pets, and those
Yeah,
losses are devastating.
for sure.
So, yeah, I can appreciate your world revolving around your sweet little dog. But for those who are not familiar with Casket Case, can you just give, like, a brief premise of the story and what people could expect?
Sure. So, Casket Case is a small town romance about a woman named Nora who moves back to her hometown of Rabbittown, Alabama after her parents die to run their family casket store. And she meets a man named Garrett who seems like he's perfect. And then she finds out he is a logistics coordinator for death. So, that is the synopsis.
I am obsessed with it. I'm not gonna lie, when I first read that, I was like, "Expound. I need details. What does this mean? I don't know." And hence the reason I was so intrigued and wanted to read it. And also, I am just like a spooky loving girl, and this was just like I just found this fascinating. But I think honestly, one of the things when I was like reading the back of this book to like just understand what it was about, like one of the things that really spoke to me was like this very ending. This clever, endearing, and romantic debut explores how love and loss are forever intertwined, but death might not be as scary as it seems. And I was so touched by that because as a grief coach and as someone who talks about death fairly often,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I almost feel like I've become like a little numb to it almost, but like we are also like hit with death and loss, whether it is like directly with those of us, maybe we've lost someone very, very close to us, or we see a celebrity that passes away, or, whatever. Like it is so intertwined in our life, as is love, and how all these things coexist and commingle is confusing. And it can be a very interesting and kind of tough thing to navigate, let alone write a book so well done that just really portrays and shows both. So I would love to ask you to like, and because I don't want to, I want to tread carefully for anybody who hasn't read this yet, because I don't totally want to also give away what a logistics coordinator for death means. Um, so as much as you can, without totally spilling the beans, can you just give us like a little background on how you created the characters, the storyline, because it for me, it's very unique and really fun.
Yeah, so honestly, very naively, it started as a joke about my love life, and I had been making a lot of questionable choices in that arena, and,
Mhm.
I just sort of a friend asked, "Was I seeing someone that weekend?" And I was like, "The angel of death, I hope," which is a terrible joke and not even funny, but I thought, "Wait, that could be something, like, dating the angel of death, what is that?" And it sort of I mean, as it started there, and I'm not a fantasy writer, so, like, the first
Mhm.
image in my head was kind of a grim reaper comes to her door to
Yeah,
pick her up, and,
yeah.
that is a book for someone else to write. So, I'm also a fan of, I was a fan of The Office and Parks and Rec and all the workplace comedies, and so I was like, "How can I make it as boring as possible?" Like, death, with, like, an HR department and just
Yeah.
kind of, um I also like to poke fun at things that, like corporations and, big industries that maybe we don't pay that much attention to, but that are around us constantly.
Yeah.
So that is how it started, and then, of course, as I start writing it, it again, I said it started as a joke, like, naively, because as I start writing it, I'm like, "Oh, I have to sort out how I feel about all this and
Uh-huh.
how these different characters who come from very different I mean, not extremely different backgrounds, but they kind
But
of have a
different enough.
different yeah, like a different mentality or something about death or
Yes.
about also kind of a different timing about,
Yeah.
deaths that they have experienced in their lives. So some have
Mhm.
had more time than others, and so I was kind of exploring that and playing around with what that looks like for each person and for people who might have differing opinions on all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because I mean, definitely, as you mentioned, like, Nora and Garrett specifically, like, and there is such a fun love story there, but yeah, they both know death in their own way. Again, without spoiling too much, Garrett has
Mhm.
also endured a very devastating loss, and I will say, ultimately sort of led him into the work that he does, which I also really empathize and resonate with because that is exactly what
Mhm.
happened to me as well. I was not recruited perhaps in the way that, that he was. I'll just word it that way. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think it's such a, and actually, same with Nora. I mean, taking over her parents' company. Would she have done that? Would that have even been on her radar if her parents didn't die? Like,
Mhm.
you can answer, but no, probably not. I think that's how a lot of us kind of get into sometimes we fall into the things that we do because of these major life events and life altering things and losses that happen to us. And so I think that for me, that was a big takeaway from this story is just like how transformational going through a major earth shattering loss can be and the ripple effect of that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, can quite literally change the trajectory of our life, which is kind of a big deal. So,
Yeah, and that's kind of thank you for saying that. I was really trying to, represent a character going through a loss like that,
yeah.
as well as I could as somebody, like both of my parents are still alive, and so I
I was
haven't
gonna
gone
ask
through
you about that. Yeah, even and it's obviously fine that you haven't gone through a loss and actually
that.
losing and if anything, I mean, major kudos to you because as someone who has lost parents,
Mhm.
like, there were so many themes and things that you hit on in here that I think even when I first reached out to you, I was like, there's just so much here that I think so many grievers can relate to and are very realistic for somebody who has been through something. So I apologize. I don't want to interrupt you, but yeah. So tapping into that essentially from your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to honor and I think this is true in any part of life. It doesn't even have to
Yeah.
just be like when a death happens to you, but grieving a future that doesn't happen.
Hmm.
And that for me, I mean, I've had that situation happen in, plenty of different ways. You don't get the job you
Sure.
want,
Yeah. It doesn't have to be death, right?
yeah, it could be anything, but you've had this idea in your head of this is what I'm gonna do. Like Nora had this idea, I'm gonna go to college, I'm gonna go
Mhm.
out of my hometown. I'm gonna leave here and I'm gonna, get this career somewhere else. And
Right.
then this thing happens and I don't think it's realistic. I think some people are better at this than others, and some
Mhm.
people are go-getters, and as soon as something happens, they're like, "Oh, I'm shifting. I'm doing this now. This is my new plan." But I don't think it's realistic for everybody. And so I,
Yes.
as somebody who that would not be realistic for, I really wanted to kind of show somebody who had no drive or push to kind of do the next thing and decide
Yeah,
what that is. Like there was no reason for her to decide that. So
right.
I was really interested in kind of writing about that position, I
Yeah.
guess.
I love that, and that was actually one of the and frankly, and I say this in a good way, I was kind of irritated with her at some points because she
Yeah.
was so stuck and, like,
Yeah.
unwilling almost to kind of, like to move, to get herself out of her and literally, so many people around her that love her dearly are like, "What are you doing here? Go, like, go live your life, your parents wouldn't want this for you," or, paraphrasing obviously what they said, but,
Yeah.
so many but she was, like, kind of her own worst enemy in that way,
Mhm.
but I bring this up because I do feel like there are so many of us, people here listening maybe, that are stuck or almost, like, fighting natural growth and natural moving forward, not moving on, we're
Mhm.
not getting over our loss, but we it's like we almost wanna stay stuck so we maybe feel closer to
Mhm.
them, or we feel we owe them something, or we owe ourselves something, like, there's these forces or these things that we impose on ourselves that we feel we need to, like, live up to or something that prevents us from evolving as
Mhm.
we are naturally meant to after we go through a loss.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of people or a lot of reviews that are just very annoyed by Nora as a person, and I'm sort of
That
like, "Well,
always
yeah, I wrote her that way." You know?
Yeah, like,
So
that you mean you did your job because that if it's evoking something in that, like, yeah, that's the point. Like,
yeah.
she is kinda getting in her own way and being a touch annoying about it, but for me, I saw that as,
Yeah.
like, good writing 'cause that's the point. Like, we're
Yeah,
supposed to be
I
frustrated
wanted
with her.
yeah, I wanted to kind of give voice to that voice in your head among other things that is like, "I don't wanna do this." Like, I don't want
Yeah,
to. And,
yeah,
like you were saying, like, moving on sometimes means letting it go, and maybe you're not ready to do that. And I think there's always part of us that's kind of like, "I'm not ready." And so I kind of
yeah.
wanted to make that be kind of let that come out in her, I guess.
Yeah, definitely, and it's yeah, and I think you nailed it because there's yeah, I mean, there's so many and I one thing I also really, like, resonated with in my own ways was some of her, like, I guess you could say coping mechanisms or things that were,
Yeah.
like, of comfort to her that were part of, like, her normal routine that she, like, refused to get out of. Whether that was, like, drinking some wine or watching a certain show or whatever it was, and I just think that is where a lot of us can end up, like, living and just because it's we don't have to think, we don't have to try so hard, we can but that's where there it's like a very fine line. It's like, okay, we can do that, we can lean on these coping mechanisms every once in a while, but, like but also what are we doing to get ourselves
Mhm.
out of that a little bit. And also and Garrett, I think, has a big role in that as well. It would have been interesting to see what happened to her if he didn't come along.
Mhm. Yeah, for
She'd
sure.
still
Yeah.
probably be doing her same shit.
Yes,
But
truly. And I also liked it being kind of like, what she's doing is questionable, but it's not so bad. I think we
yeah,
see the 2 ends. Like, we see somebody who just bounces back, and we're going, and we're hustling our way through all of this, and then we see
yeah,
somebody who is, at the pit of
yes,
despair and needs actual help. Like, these are the
yes,
2 sides, and so I kind of
yeah.
wanna show someone in the middle where it's like, what she's doing is not necessarily wrong, but kind of, you know what I
But it's
mean?
it's not helping her much, like,
Exactly.
getting her out of these things. Yeah, and, like, one thing I always preach is, like, is healthy coping mechanisms or, like, things that, just doing one little action every day to sort of, like, not get yourself out of it, but just sparks joy for you or something. And
Yeah.
eventually I feel like she does kind of start to come into her own. So she's making updates or adjustments to the casket store or to her house or something like that. Like she's kind of starts to find a little bit of motivation.
Mhm.
Um and yeah, but like I said, I think Garrett's like a big
Mhm.
role in that. Um Yeah, and they have some really interesting, so kinda touching on the love story a little bit, they have, like, some great banter, and there's some chemistry there for sure. Um, how did you kind of, like, tap into Garrett's side of things? And again, this is might be a little bit tricky to answer without giving away sort of his whole thing, because then there's a whole 'nother plot twist at the very end of the book that I also don't wanna give away, but again, I just wanna encourage people to read it because it's like, "Whoa, didn't see that coming," uh, with him and other people around her. But, yeah, can you is there anything you can expound on there? And as far as how his grief and what his losses have sort of, led him to, and if you need to kind of, like, just sort of reveal what he went through, I feel like we could do that without giving away, like,
Mhm.
the rest of the story, but
Yeah, so I think when I started writing it, you kind of have to figure out because I obviously kind of started with a plot versus characters,
Mhm.
so you kind of have to figure out what characters would do this and,
Sure, yeah.
what type of person would work for death and why.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I will say from sort of the behind the scenes writing standpoint, that was sort of the last piece that I
mhm.
really I really had to fight to get that out of myself because I
Yeah.
just could not find Garrett, so to speak, and,
Yeah.
it really helped writing from his perspective and really kind of, separating him out, so you'll see some chapters in the book that are from him,
Yes.
and
Yeah, I love that because it gives you more into his mind. Yeah, and
yeah,
why
and
he
I
is
was
the way he is.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I was trying to do it without that at first, and
Mhm.
you just can't really get I couldn't get what I needed from, her just the third person point of view, but
Yeah.
I yeah, so Garrett his had a death in his family at a young age that sort of pushed him to want to help others who are kind of going through a similar situation or help.
Mhm.
Um, it was it was a positive thing that came out of a negative
Yeah.
experience, or that is
Yeah.
sort of how
That's a
Garrett
great
sees it. And
Mhm.
so he ended up, taking this job to work for death to help, you know,
Yeah.
the people who are dying, but also kind of be, you know, a comfort to those who are around them, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a perfect way to word it without
I was trying
giving
really
away.
hard.
I know, you did a great job. I know, it's so tough. Yeah, I think that's ultimately, that is certainly where it, again, without giving away some plot points, like, that is ultimately what leads to some conflict, sort of the climax of the book, if you will, is,
Mhm.
um, they're at their core, they understand and cope with and view death and loss and who's at fault for that even very differently. Maybe we could take the conversation in this direction so it
Yeah.
doesn't go too much. But I think that's actually a great point to bring up, and that is something I wanted to, like, kinda get to, is how people view life and death and coping with that and finding meaning in that, so differently. And as a grief coach, as someone who has also just lost people, like, that is so true. The way that I handle a loss or someone else might is not the way that another person would, or there's just so many timelines and things that are imposed on people that are grieving that can make that process very confusing, and like they're kind of doing it wrong. And even as I'm saying this, I can think of some other characters sort of around Nora that are a little like that too. They're not, I don't want to say they ever so much were like, you need to get over it, but
Mhm.
they were definitely, I think, maybe like pushing her to kind of move on,
Yeah.
move in some other direction. And truthfully, I think she did need a little bit of that. Um, a little bit of tough love, like,
Yeah.
oh my God, okay, get out of your, oh, woe is me sort of,
Mhm.
you know, wheel here. But yeah, I think it was a very, I don't know, it was a great, like, sort of maybe underlying point of the book too, is just how we can all view and interpret death and loss and what that looks like and how things happen and why things happen and ultimately what I loved and what I really appreciated about Garrett is there is sort of this like, it's all going to affect us at some point. Why
Mhm.
not come together? Why not, make it a little less painful, a little easier, for lack of a better term, I'll leave it there,
Yeah.
um, than it might otherwise be. And yeah, but him and Nora are very, different in that way. But I appreciated seeing that sort of, both sides of the coin.
Yeah, I do think, like you said, a lot of people have different reactions to things that happen, and I also think I mean, obviously, being born and dying are kind of the 2 universal things that we all do, and they, to me, are kind of the most, I don't know, kind of mysterious things
Oh,
that
1000%. Yeah,
happen. We don't wanna talk about birth, and we don't wanna talk about death either,
yeah,
and that's kind of odd, but
because we all
it
do it. Like, it's not gonna.
and you'd think that'd be just an easy connection point. Like,
Yeah.
eventually someone that you love is gonna die and eventually and you can match that up with somebody else's. I don't know. It's odd, but
Mhm.
that we don't talk
Yeah,
about it. But
yeah.
I I think blame is also something common because I think it can look like a lot of different things. You've
Yeah.
got, you might have I mean, I think back to when, like, my grandmother died, and I was very concerned about knowing the exact
Yeah.
reason. Like, what was the reason? But why was I trying to know that? Like, what?
Yeah.
And it's, you're just looking
Yeah.
for anything to point your finger at, and I think
Yeah.
Nora and Garrett kind of went different directions, and Nora was looking for someone to blame, and she found someone there that she could easily point at, so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a great point. There's a lot of like ego sort of in death. That just
Mhm.
we're living such like a human experience that we and I think it's for closure too. Like we just can't like wrap our heads sometimes around they're here one moment, they're gone the next. Why did they have to be taken from us in that way? And this could apply to multiple characters in the book, right?
Mhm.
Of various losses that they've gone through. And yeah, there is a sense making that I think a lot of us go through, and that's where a lot of, like, resentment and anger and frustration, can come in because and I got that a lot from Nora. I think she was just there's a lot of things that she felt frustrated by maybe, wasn't
Mhm.
fair and was sort of, allowing herself to be sort of stuck in that a little bit versus but then it's like, okay, well, what do we do instead? Well, that's sort of the work I do as well is like, well, okay, well, we have to release that a little bit. Like, and so what can we do to, you know, loosen the grip on that a little bit and kind of come to understand there might not be a why. Sometimes things just happen,
Mhm.
unfortunately. There might not be a reason for it. It's not some big karmic thing or lesson or whatever. And that's what I appreciated about Garrett is he kind of was just very honest. And I think he got there, or he's was maybe a little further along in that journey of realizing that certainly more than Nora was. She took a little convincing, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think he also, he speaks kind of for the pragmatic ones of us who
Yes.
are just
Yes.
like, "Can we just say what it is?" So, that was
Yeah.
interesting to write from that perspective too.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting that. He definitely was more pragmatic. And I think almost like made death almost more, like, factual in a way and sort of almost took sort of the woo-woo out of it for a
Mhm.
little bit, which was also sort of refreshing, to be honest, because he is a pretty level-headed guy, character, and he's not dumb, he's got a good head on his shoulders, and he kinda just sees things for what they are. Maybe he didn't at first, but like that's kind of where he is now. But
Mhm.
yeah, and ultimately what he does, he comes from a good place. So
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Um, I guess I'm curious too, like as far as the sort of like griefy components to this book, like from your perspective, why do you think it's important to make these things known, and even whether or not you're even doing this on purpose, I think you somehow really did a great job of this and tapped into it. But why do you think it's important that like, I guess for lack of a better term, like storylines and like grief and displaying it like this is really important, like especially through writing?
I think grief is something that if you aren't the person directly experiencing it, the people
Mm.
around you can kind of, I mean, this is stating it a little strongly, but can kind of forget about it or can kind
Yeah,
of,
yeah. No, so true.
like they have to go to work on Monday, they have
Yeah,
to move on. And
yep.
I think, having kind of talking about grief so openly and, showing characters kind of that are going through it is a reminder that, it's there is no point at which you're done grieving. Like there is no point at which, or
Yeah,
in my opinion, there is
thank
no
you. So true.
there is no point where you're just like, okay, and now grieving is over. Like this is not a destination. So
Yep.
it's just this person will always be going through this in some way, and obviously
Mhm.
some coping healthier than others. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's just kind of a good reminder, and also kind of a permission to feel that way. And
Mhm.
I mean, I mentioned my grandmother a second ago. I think she died 20 years ago, and I'm still
Yeah,
mad about it. Like,
yeah.
I'm not over it, and I probably will never be over it. And that, she lived a long life and et cetera, et cetera. And I
Yeah.
think, there are plenty of people out there going through, on one side of or the other of it, they're the one dying, or they are supporting somebody who is dying, or
Yeah.
something surprising has happened. It's just sort of it's all around us all the time, and it's easy to just get in your own life. You're working, you're doing what you need to do, and all that stuff
Yeah.
falls by the wayside, but it's still there, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just being very realistic about it, yeah, and I mean and that's why I just think what I really appreciate about your book so much is it normalized so many things, and I think that's what's so beautiful about having more stories out there like this, and even if it's technically fiction. I might have earlier said I'm a nonfiction girly. I definitely meant fiction. If I said
Yeah.
that in the beginning of the episode, let me correct myself now because 'cause I'm pretty sure I just said nonfiction. I like nonfiction too, but I am a fiction girly, like I said. Anyway, so yeah, but I think it just even though, yes, there's parts of it, it's fiction, but there's just a reality that you were able to bring to life that really just hit on so many very realistic aspects of what the grieving process looks and feels like. And remind me again, I think at the time of this, like the story when this is taking place, her parents had died like a year ago, I think
Mhm.
it was.
Yeah.
So she was like, yeah, like still in it, right? And still in the thick of it. And I also should mention, and I don't think this will give away any like too many plot points, and I'll just kind of leave it high level, but she also goes through an ending relationship as well.
Mhm.
So, which also complicates some things. And I'm trying to remember timeline wise if that was, like, in and around the time her parents died, I think, or maybe it was after.
Yeah, it was
It was
after.
just after, yeah.
Mhm.
I also empathized with because that also happened to me. It was, like, a little bit before my
Oh.
dad died and after my mom. So I was just like, "This girl is me," essentially. But spoiler alert, it was with my husband, we got back together and things are fine. But
Aw.
that doesn't always happen for people, and it adds to the complexities of thing. And so also I think there's something on here, and that's again why I'm so glad you kind of wove that in there because there's living losses that we have to cope with too. So to take it back to your earlier point, so of course there's these massive deaths of her parents, and then there's a relationship that she perhaps thought she was gonna be in for longer term than she was. And so there's grief around that. And then, as you mentioned, like navigating a life that you didn't sign up for, or you thought you were going to have a different path than you ended up having. So this girl's got a lot going on. So I can kind of see why she was like a little stuck and being kind of annoying about it. Uh, but that's a big deal. And so I think it just goes back to your point of like why this is sort of a lifelong thing because people are people can be very quick to be like, you got to start moving on. You got to like get used to, whatever. Okay, sure, to an extent and to a certain point. yes, there is a moving forward that needs to happen, but, like, let's take a step back and think about the gravity of all of these losses, like, on top of each other, and here you are for years thinking you might have had more time with people, or your relationship status was gonna be different, or you thought you were gonna go to a certain school and you're not anymore, you were gonna move and all these things, and now you're kinda back to square one, and, like, that's a big deal.
Yeah, and
Like
also being have sort of having a community around you with, she
mhm,
obviously had her parents, she had this relationship, she had the friends that she was living with when all of this happened, and,
yeah,
in response, because she feels like they are all normal and I am not normal, she sort of pulls away and winds up, I mean,
yeah,
she has a community around her at home, and,
yeah,
like, she has her grandpa, she has some family friends around, but other than that, she's kind of by herself, and,
yeah.
you
She
know.
isolates quite a bit, whether she self-isolates or not, but yeah,
Yeah.
she definitely kinda lives in her little bubble, so to
Yeah, and
speak.
if there's nobody being like, "Hey, let's go do something," then she has no reason to, and I
Yeah,
really kind of wanted to show that of, if you don't you know, you don't need a reason to do anything, I guess, but she really didn't have one. She was just kind of
yeah,
like, I'm running this store, and I have
yeah,
this house, and I'm living in it, and,
yeah.
you know, that's the
It's
end,
like
that's what's happening."
kinda felt obligated to do so, or that's how I sort of took it
Yeah.
away, is like, it was really not because she sort of felt like it was her calling. It was she I almost don't know how to word this. She was, like, kind of living for dead people in
Yeah.
a way. You know what I mean? She was
Yeah.
like her life was not her own, and she was sort of living for her dead parents in a way and trying to keep their legacy alive and their house going and in good condition, and the store, it was everyone else's life, but sort of hers. So I think that was a big for me, like, as a reader that and who knows grief, like,
Mhm.
that was a big takeaway and a big, like, wake-up call. Like, if I wasn't sort of in the place that I'm at in my grieving journey now, which is far better than it used to be, that would have been a big wake-up call for me, like, reading this and, like, "Oh, I don't know, it's just a beautiful lesson and theme that came out of this book because I think sometimes seeing it, especially on paper, but, someone else's situation kinda makes you self-reflect. Like, this book is great for self-reflection on your own grieving experience, and if you can, like, have any parallels to some of the things that Nora has said or done, it's like, "Whoa, there I see a little of myself in that. Okay, let me evaluate what I'm doing here."
Yeah,
Yeah.
sort of whether you like it or not.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Is there any, parts of, like, creating this story or the storyline or these griefier parts, like, because, for example, you have not lost parents, or was there
Mhm.
anything in any of the character stories or anything like that that you found kinda, like, hard to write about because you haven't necessarily, like, journeyed through some of the things that they're going through, or did you find that some of your other life experiences just lent its hand to just navigating grief overall, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of it was difficult to write in the sense that I didn't want to write it, Nora is
Mm,
somebody I created, and now I'm having to ruin her life, and that wasn't always fun. Um, but I do have my own experiences, like, when I was writing this book, I have my experiences with, like, depression and anxiety, and I was in a pretty, rough depressive state at the time, and so my first draft of this was in first person, and it was
mm.
depression on the page,
Oh my
and I, of course, didn't the grieving your parents part was something I was trying to draw out, but
mhm.
the sitting home and drinking wine and watching television shows over and over, I had that on lock, so I could, you know, take from
Yeah,
personal experience all of, what that entails,
sure.
but then I
We've all been there.
think yes, so then I read it after I've written this first person draft of depression and grief, and I'm like, "This is the most depressing thing I've ever read." Like, no one is ever gonna wanna read this. And so that's how it kind of got moved to third person because I was like, this is an important story. I want to tell
Yes.
it, but I need some space from it
Mhm.
as sort of an outside viewer of what is happening. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was difficult in that way. And then writing Garrett was, you know, you I didn't want him to come off as callous
Right. Yes.
because
Yeah.
he's not. And
Yeah.
but
Not at all.
sometimes when you're in the thick of it, it can feel that way, even if that's not where he's coming from. So
Mhm.
there's also a part with another character at the very end of the book. I did
Mhm.
not want to write, and
Mhm.
I didn't at first. And after I got my agent, we were kind of going through edits, and she was like, what if you tried to write that? And I was
Mhm.
like, I don't want to. And she was kind of like, what if you did though? So then,
Just do it. I say this with love, but do it.
yes. So then I had to write that against my will, so to speak, I guess.
Mhm.
But it was difficult to write. But I mean, I guess to my credit, that's pretty much the first draft of it. The epilogue is
Wow.
what I'm talking about. But I mean, it
Yeah.
pretty much didn't get touched by anyone. I sat down and did it, and that's how it came out. And
Wow.
I'm happy with it, even though it took me a lot to get there.
It's exhausting. I mean, to write something like that and to seriously, the ending of this book, you guys, is wild. Um, yeah, to tap into some of the things that you have here and in the way that you have done it, especially not perhaps even going through some of the exact things that these characters have. I mean, that takes a lot of skill and going to places that maybe you're unfamiliar with, or even if you're familiar with them, that are just hard to write about and get it on page. So, I mean, is writing for you, like for me, it's very cathartic. It can be painful for sure. Like there are some things where I'm just like, I know I need to get this out, but like, oh, this is a dark road I'm going down here.
Yes.
Do you find that with writing? Like, do you find it cathartic, or how did you sort of feel writing the book?
Yeah, I definitely found it cathartic. I also, I kind of wrote, I forget what writer says this, but I kind of wrote to figure out what I thought. So it was sort of
Yeah.
like I wrote all of this as I was going, and then as I was going back and editing, it would be like, oh, I guess this is how I was feeling that day, and do I still feel
Yeah.
like that today? And
Oh,
it
that's interesting.
kind of going through the edits, it almost felt like I was reading my diary because it took me years to
Ooh,
write this. Like I think I started writing maybe I think I thought of it in maybe like 2017 and I started writing it in
wow,
like 2019. So
that's
it was
wild. Oh my
years
gosh.
of it. So there was stuff at the end, like when I got the finished copy and I was reading it, I was like, I don't even remember this. Like, I don't know when I wrote this. Who even knows? So, yeah.
And
But
you'd have
yes.
been in a completely different frame of mind, like,
Yeah.
at that point. That is so wild. This is sort of like a little journal for you. Like, this is like a little time capsule almost,
Yeah,
like,
a little bit.
that's really cool. I was gonna ask you how long it took to write that. Wow. So,
Yeah.
just
I
kind of
mean,
chipped away at it a little.
yeah, I mean, having a full-time job and
I
also,
feel
you
you on
know,
that.
I mentioned kind of the depression and anxiety of it all.
Yeah,
When I first started
sure.
writing it, it was kind of like getting anything on the page was good. And
Mhm.
then, it sort of progressed and got better and,
Yeah.
shout out to therapy. So all of that and
Right.
medication.
Yeah, yeah, let's
Yeah.
normalize that too, okay,
Yeah,
yeah, getting the
exactly.
help that you need for sure. Yeah, oh my god. Well, I really just can't say enough good things. I think, like I said, I think it's such a fun read. I really hope everyone checks it out. I mean, I could keep going on and on. I mean, there's really just so many, very, like I said, just very important themes of grief that you hit on here, and just like being ready and receptive to moving forward and getting out of your comfort zone, and just giving yourself permission, like you were saying earlier, to sort of explore what life means and looks like for you now. So I really encourage anyone here listening who resonates with anything that we've said today, but definitely those overarching themes. I think there's like a lot of like little things in here that I think are also very griefy and awesome, and like very, again, just relatable things to call out, of like how we honor our loved ones, or
Mhm.
just how she tries to keep her parents alive, sort of through the store or otherwise, that are also just very heartwarming and just hit home to read. But to just sort of like wrap this up, and just the best way that you can answer this, just with the experiences that you do have, since this is the Life with Grief podcast, and we are all living with grief here. And as you said so well, like it is a never ending journey, right? It evolves. What does sort of like living with grief mean to you or look like for you? You've kind of answered this already, but if you have any sort of last words of wisdom.
Um, I don't know if I have any wisdom, but I think living with grief for me is being kind of, I guess, honest with myself
Hmm.
and sort of looking it in the face.
Yeah.
And that I think in sort of, I guess, lesser moments, running away from it is the choice, and
Mhm.
think of anything but that and how can I be distracted.
It's true for a
And
lot of people.
yeah, that is definitely my go-to. And
Mhm.
so I think, you know, living with, I mean, kind of like Nora, like living with a future that you didn't plan and living with a life that you didn't plan, no matter what that
Right.
might be. Um,
Mhm.
I think just being honest about it, because I think that's kind of where you start to get in trouble when you
Yeah.
are not being truthful with yourself. And, you can't get help from others if you're not being truthful about it and if you're not being
Mhm.
honest and open about where you are. And that can be really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there are a lot of us, especially women who are, I mean, I'm 35. I think girl bossing, hustle and grind. If you just push through anything, it will be fine. And that might be literally true, but it is like terrible advice sometimes. And I
I
think,
so agree.
you cannot hustle your way out of it and
No.
just be like, today's not a good day for me, or,
Yeah.
I
Yes.
can tell it's not going to be a good day for me, or whatever it might be, just kind of, knowing where you are. And, but also you can look back at where you've come from too. I think most people, I mean, I don't necessarily agree that time just heals everything, but I think time is helpful. And,
Mhm.
kind of the further along you get, hopefully you can kind of see where you've come from and use
Yeah.
that as like a positive thing where, you did get out of bed today, and that's
Yeah.
a good thing.
That was step
Some days you
1. Yeah.
didn't. Yeah.
And that's something
So,
to celebrate some days. Seriously. Like, yeah,
yeah.
it is. And thank you also for being vulnerable and sharing the anxiety and depression and everything too. I mean, I know there are also people coping with that here, whether related to a loss that they've been through or not. So thank you for that as well, because I think a lot of even some of the things, whether Nora dealt with them or
Mhm.
whoever, like, very, again, very relatable, very common. And a lot of people might think that they're not doing things right, or it's like that there's red flags going up for things like that. And it's like, we've talked about some ways to cope and when to get help and when you might be okay. Um, so many themes of grieving, i.e. a person, but also just like the realities of anxiety and depression too are
Mhm.
very prominent in both. And yeah,
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 definitely.
definitely. Thank you for that. I actually have one very last question that
Yeah.
came up for me as you were talking, but is also is sort of relevant to this book. And I'm just curious whether, I guess I'm sort of curious how your perspective was on death prior to writing this book, or maybe slash like when you were writing it, or like now. Has your perspective on death changed at all? Maybe since like writing this book, or just like because death is it's a big theme in this book. Let's be real. Not in like a super dark way though, actually, which I think a lot of people think like death, like why would I want to read a book that like is
Yeah.
the plot is centered around death? Trust me, you guys, you want to read this book because it's not what you think. But yeah, I was just curious from like a personal perspective, like what's your kind of relationship with that now?
Yeah, I think, again, I went into this so naively of just, I'm gonna make some funny jokes about dating, and, I had to kind of come to terms, like you're saying, with my own thoughts on it. And I think it allowed me to kind of work out using fictional people, like, work
Mhm.
out my own feelings about it because, you know, like we've talked about, like, death is a universal experience. It
Yeah.
happens every day to so many people, and,
Mhm.
I think I had to I think once I gave myself the permission to lean in and I was like, "Okay, I'm writing a rom-com about death, so we're gonna write about death."
Let's go
And
let's go big or go home here.
so, I think it also has almost kind of normalized it a bit more for me because and I mean, you do this every day, so you probably kind of know a bit where I'm coming from, where you kind of become the death person. Like, I'm writing a book about death, everyone knows it, so let's talk
Yeah.
about it, and
Oh, just own it.
yes. So,
Yeah.
I think that's been interesting too, is getting to hear from so many people, like, so many people have reached out to me and said, like, "This resonated with me because I've lost someone," and I think
Mhm.
getting to hear those experiences, like, I'm really honored that people choose to share that with me,
Yeah.
and I also it kind of gives me a new community that I wasn't part of
Yeah.
beforehand of, "Let's all just talk about this together," and
Yeah.
I don't know, it's like, it is heavy for sure, and it is sad, but, I mean, you've gotta laugh at some of the stuff, right? Like, some
Yes.
stuff is just funny, and you can't help it, and stuff
I
people s
literally just was thinking dark humor. I mean, you just have to laugh at how freaking painful and unfair and absolutely ridiculous it is, some of the stuff that
Yeah,
we have to go through. Like,
yeah.
eventually, yeah, you can laugh about it, like we have done in this episode. Like, it's just it's yeah, you just are kinda, like, just shaking your head sometimes being like, "Wow, okay. Didn't sign up for this, but
Yeah,
here I
can
am."
I ask you a question?
Sure, yeah.
So, as, like, a grief coach, I'm curious what you would say to Nora if
That's a
if you
great
came across
question.
her.
I mean, I like where she was at the end of the book better than I did at the beginning. So I guess it depends on which version of her I'm sort of talking to. If I were to talk to her at the sort of the beginning of the book, and also as someone who also does not have her parents, I guess
Mhm.
I would just say, you know, I like what we've talked about today. It's validating and just recognizing the gravity and the yeah, just the gravity of who we have lost and the circumstances around that. Her circumstances were different than mine, but I'm not going to give that away. But regardless, parent or dad, right?
Mhm.
Those are the people you came from. They are your
Yeah.
north stars for so many of us. They are for those who have a good relationship with their
Mhm.
parents.
Yeah.
Um, they uh, they're our home, so I think for her I can really relate to she physically has a home, sure. She has the store, she has ways that she's connected to her parents physically still, but not only are they physically gone, which is also just again it's like a human to human experience, like it's very weird physically not having that human body right walking through the door to say hi to us and hug us and stuff. But that's a big deal to lose the 2 people that they're your home, for all intents and purposes. So, I would kinda just wanna, like, sit with her and, like, "Okay, let's relish in that a little bit. Let's, like, wallow in that. Let's acknowledge that, and acknowledge that every single day and feel empowered in acknowledging that fact, and do not let anybody around you tell you that that is not a big deal or that you're not allowed to do that, you are. But I guess I would also sort of ask like, well, what would they want you to be doing in this situation? What would they tell you if they saw sort of the state of your life right now?
Mhm.
And sometimes we can have people say that to us or tell us that and they're just like, I know what they would say. They want me to move on. I get it. I know, but I'm not ready. Okay, that's fine. You're not ready. But what could you do? Not even right now, but like what could you do tomorrow morning that could be a step in taking on a new perspective of your life without your parents? How can you get curious about your grief? How can you um like get to know this version of yourself now as a parentless daughter? Because there is a new version of yourself. There is no uh that version of yourself prior to those losses. There they're kind of gone, right? Because loss and it can change us so profoundly. But being sort of that new version of ourselves is not always a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a scary thing. It's something that I guess I would just encourage to like, just empower her to get curious about little by little. Baby steps is what I always say.
Mhm.
Um, and just like, and also think of maybe ways that she could like take care of herself just like a little bit better in some moments, or scale back on certain things.
Yeah, maybe eat a
Um,
vegetable or something, yeah.
exactly. But also having her moments where she's just like, "I can't be bothered today," and knowing that that's okay too.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so because the first year is certainly the hardest in many ways, but then there is a permanence that comes, and I think that's where Garrett is a little bit further along. He knows that permanence and he can feel that, and how it has affected the years since he's lost who he's lost. And so I think that's where their perspective probably differs a little bit too. He's just a little more into it. And, there's a whole nother evolution that comes when we, year 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, where that the permanence of their loss really starts to settle in. And there's a whole nother set of griefy things that come along with that. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a very long answer, but I guess I would just tell her to sort of like take her time, but also find little things that kind of spark joy for her. Who is she now? How can she tap into more of herself in her own life versus, making sure grandpa's okay, making sure the store's okay, making sure the house is okay. I'm not seeing any of the essence of her in any of that. So, not that I blame her, but, so she's living for herself and not, people that are no longer here or just people around her that want the best for her and want her to enjoy her life too.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think it's
Yeah.
good that we
That's a
have
great question.
people like you in the world to help people kind of, because I mean, it is a sliver of your life that not everyone understands, right? So
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
great that you can be there and like, this is the thing we're talking about. This is the
Yep.
subject. We're not getting around it. This is
Yep.
what we're addressing, you know? I think that's
Yeah,
great.
so let's face it head on, 'cause what other choice do we have, right? Like,
Yeah.
only makes it worse if you don't talk about it or don't write about it or,
Yeah.
however we gotta let it out. So, Lauren, thank you so much for this conversation today. This is, like, so unique, like, I've never had an episode like this, so I'm super excited. Where can everyone find your book, get in touch with you, all the good things?
Yeah, so you can get Casket Case at, Barnes& and Noble, all your general bookstores at the airport,
Airports,
and
apparently.
all and those links also are on my website. That's laurenbevans.com, and I'm on Instagram at Lauren Evans Writes, and I'm on Substack at Lauren Evans. And most of the
Awesome.
things you can find me on Instagram. I usually post things there first. So thank you so
Perfect.
much
Well,
for having me. This has
of
been
course. Yeah, this
really
will all be linked in
interesting.
the show notes as well. Yeah, it was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed I was so excited to talk to you because I was just like I just really was so curious to hear how this all came together for you, and I think some of the things we've touched on today are just going to be very eye-opening and very impactful for people to hear, and, yeah, I just really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you're taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, membership, more coping tools, ways to work with me, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Losses Become Gains, and on Instagram and TikTok at Life with Grief Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. And remember to always keep asking yourself, how will I turn my losses into gains today? I'll catch you in the next episode.